Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Peace Week keynote talk by Chelsea Clinton. You are sitting in the 15th Street Meetinghouse as guests of Friends Seminary, and we welcome you. I'd like us to, in the manner of friends, begin with a moment of silence. Thank you. Tonight's talk is the public launch of a week's worth of very rich and dynamic experiences intended to bring our students into intimate proximity with the Quaker peace testimony. This year's theme, Let Your Life Speak, reminds us that each of us can, if we are willing, use our voice and talents to bring about peace. We don't have to be generals or elected officials or even activists. In this, I'm reminded of the quote based on the words of Klaus Nobel. Peace is not just the absence of war, it is the way we choose to act on a daily basis towards ourselves, our fellow human beings, our families, our friends, our enemies, and our planet. People often think that peace is brought about by a treaty or a ceasefire, but sometimes it can result from one simple act of kindness. This means that every day, each of us bears the responsibility for peace. Perhaps it would be better to say, each of us should seize the opportunity to make peace. Our speaker tonight has certainly let her life speak, whether standing by her mother's side in the 1990s demanding equal rights for women around the world, or clerking the service committee at Sidwell Friends. And now she has codified her work and her beliefs in words, in the form of her new book, It's Your World, a book that encourages young people to take control and let their lives speak, much like the Quakers. I first met Chelsea Clinton when she was about 13 and I was about 30. When we both arrived for our first day of classes in the upper school at Sidwell Friends, I as the new dean and Chelsea as a freshman. I got to know Chelsea pretty quickly because my office had been chopped in half to accommodate some of the fittest, sharpest, smartest people I'd ever known. They mostly sat in their office all day, but when the bell rang, they would emerge, scanning the crowd. The lunch sign-out was in my office. Chelsea would come in with her friends, some of whom are here tonight, and without a word, these people would, like ducklings, follow Chelsea and her friends out the door, always keeping a respectful distance. That is, except when Chelsea would sneak out of the building, causing them to have career-ending palpitations. Tonight, I can't help but compare those days to now, when children of a president, vice president, and a chunk of the cabinet could go to a school that didn't have a fence, didn't have a receptionist, didn't have locks on its doors, and had multiple entries, none of which were locked or attended. This pre-9/11 era, in contrast to the world we live in today, represented its own kind of peace. We just didn't know it then. But back to our speaker. What impressed me most was how quickly Chelsea made deep and lasting friendships, and how protective her fellow students at Sidwell were. Come as often as they might and ambush students on the sidewalk on their way off the campus, the paparazzi never got a quote about Chelsea from a fellow student. It was a point of pride for those of us at Sidwell that we could give the young Chelsea the space, support, and routine that she needed. Setting aside who her parents were, Chelsea was always our priority. But it wasn't all Quakerly bliss. Chelsea had to take her lumps, for instance, when she extended a spring break, an absolute no-no at Sidwell Friends, to travel with her mother on a special mission to Africa. She was lopped, which is what the student-created verb form of loss of privileges, Sidwell's version of our in-house. No objections, no complaints, no parental intercession. Chelsea knew the rules and she knew the consequences. Chelsea's commitment as an adult to global issues, such as AIDS and rights for women and girls, as well as her personal graciousness and generosity, certainly are rooted in her home and upbringing. But I'd also like to think that her years at a Quaker school gave shape and urgency to that work. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Chelsea Clinton, Friends School alumna, mother-to-be, and author, to speak about her book, It's Your World. Chelsea.
Clearly, when I arrived at Sidwell that day that is quite long ago, as measured in time, it feels as if it isn't a distant memory. I had no idea how blessed I would be in the teachers and the administrators who oversaw the school that I was lucky enough to consider part of my home over those 4.5 years until I went to Stanford. I have long admired and respected and been grateful to Bo for appropriately administering the lumps when they had to come, but even more for being such an extraordinary and positive role model, confidant, and later friend. So I was so privileged and honored to be asked to speak this evening during Peace Week by a school that I esteem because of the shared tradition with a school that has meant so much to me, but also because Bo asked. So just thank you to all of you for giving me the chance to be embarrassed by Bo this evening and to share a couple of hugs. I'm really grateful that my husband, Mark, is here and that two of my old friends from Sidwell are also here that Bo mentioned, both of whom are in an incredibly embarrassing photograph that he showed me right before I emerged. I was asked to speak this evening about It's Your World, as well as to talk a little bit about the impact that my Quaker education continues to have on my life. So I will do both of those and then open the floor to your questions, whether about It's Your World or anything else that might be on your mind or in your heart, and if it's too personal, I won't answer it. Before I begin, though, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that today is Rosa Parks' birthday, and I could not imagine a better heroine or standard bearer for what Bo spoke about in peace being a series of actions, as well as clearly a series of reactions, than Rosa Parks. So I think, although I doubt today was planned to coincide with her birthday, could not imagine a more propitious or serendipitous convergence. So first to talk about It's Your World. And when I talk to people about It's Your World, whether I'm in forums like this or more casual conversations, I've found that I am generally asked two questions. Why did you write this book and what is it about? So I thought I would preempt those and structure my talk around those questions before opening the floor more broadly. But first, a bit of context that goes back even earlier than when Bo and I met 23 years ago. Oh, maybe. So this is the least embarrassing picture I could find of myself from almost 30 years ago. And the reason I show this picture, although I'm in a softball uniform, and this was likely the height of my athletic achievement, is because this was around the age that I really fell in love with reading. And what I loved to read most was the newspaper. And this was back when newspaper came only in print version, so I'm sure that feels like eons ago for those of you that are digital natives. And I loved reading the newspaper, not only because it obscured the amount of honey that I dumped on my Cheerios from my mother, because she wouldn't let me have sugared cereal, but because it provided me a window into the world that wasn't dependent on what my parents or my teachers told me. I could access information about what was happening in my hometown of Little Rock or in places that at the time felt very far away, like New York City or places around the globe. I wasn't dependent on other people telling me what was going on. It's probably not surprising that that felt like a real asset in my family. I could then ask questions and start conversations and join conversations that my parents were having around the dinner table or the breakfast table about what was happening in our community or around the world. But it wasn't only newspapers. I also loved to read books, and I read this book when I was about 10 or 11. And I show a copy of 50 Simple Things Kids Can Do to Save the Earth next to It's Your World, because it wasn't until I had already picked out the cover for It's Your World that I realized they had an eerie resemblance to one another. So 50 Simple Things had such a big impact on me for a couple of reasons. One, it really informed me about what was going on in terms of pollution and climate change, global warming, things that I'm sure all of you, even the youngest among us up in the balcony, know about. But at the time, I wasn't learning about in school. So I was so grateful that 50 Simple Things informed me about what was happening. I was even more grateful, though, that it empowered me with really practical suggestions of things that I could do as a little girl in Little Rock to make a difference. Whether that was helping to start my school's first paper recycling program, or obsessively cutting up the plastic rings around six-pack cans of soda so that marine wildlife wouldn't choke and die from trash that we hadn't appropriately dealt with in Little Rock, I really felt like I could be an active citizen. But I didn't only learn about the world from what I read in the newspaper or what I read in books. I also learned about the world from the people around me. So of course my parents, but also my grandparents. I was really close to my grandmother Dorothy, and she passed away a few years ago. I still think about her every day. I miss her every day, and I am grateful to her every day for how much of her life she shared with me so that I understood how really lucky and privileged I was, and that I felt a responsibility for what she always called to expand the circle of blessings. My grandmother was born to teenage parents who weren't married. They abandoned her twice. The first time when she was 3 years old, they gave her a meal ticket to the cafeteria down the street and a key to their apartment, and they told her if she needed anything, she should go to the local fire department. I couldn't imagine having confronted a challenge like that. I also couldn't imagine having confronted a challenge like when my grandmother was 8 and her parents said, "We just can't take care of you any longer. It's just too hard." And they put her and her little sister, who was 2 at the time, by themselves on a train from Chicago to Los Angeles. That was a journey that took about a day and a half. And they went and they lived with their grandparents. And then right before her 14th birthday, her grandmother said to her, "You're now basically an adult. You need to start supporting yourself." And she worked as what she always called a mother's helper, what we today would call a nanny, and a maid in someone else's home. Thankfully, as she always viewed it, because she was an inveterate optimist, thankfully her employer supported her desire to still go to school. So she would wake up really early in the morning, and she would do one of her jobs, clean the house. She would then go to school. She'd come home from school. She'd take care of 3 little kids younger than herself, put them to bed, do her homework, go to bed herself, and get up about 4 or 5 hours later and do it all over again. And she was so grateful that she'd had the chance to go to school. She didn't focus on the fact that she'd had to start work right before her 14th birthday to be able to go to school. She focused on the fact that she was able to go to school. And she talked to me a lot when I was growing up in the 1980s about how at the time there were literally more than 200 million kids who weren't in school around the world. And she thought that was something that I, as an American kid who had a right to a free public education, should be aware of. And I'm grateful for the gift that my grandmother gave me of that sense of a discipline of gratitude, something that was deeply reinforced by my experience at Sidwell, and also a sense of how often we are deeply lucky in ways that we may not be immediately perceptive to. And so I wrote It's Your World about what I think some of the big issues in our world are, some of which, sadly, I've been worried about for a long time, like climate change or access to education because of things I read or conversations I had when I was little, things that I've become more aware of through my professional work around access to public health and healthcare here in the United States and around the world, how important women's rights are to everything that I just talked about and so many things that we haven't touched on yet. But I also wrote It's Your World to share stories of amazing young people, many of whom are a lot younger than I was, even before I read It's Your World, or before I read 50 Simple Things, who are making a real difference, a positive impact in their families, in their communities, and across our world. So I want to share a few of those stories. This is Haley. Well, obviously that's me and Rachel Ray, but Haley's the important one in the photograph. When Haley was 7, her dad was diagnosed with diabetes. And her dad was diagnosed with diabetes for many of the same reasons that my grandfather was diagnosed with diabetes. He was overweight, he didn't like to eat healthy food. In fact, he pretty much just liked to eat unhealthy food, and he really didn't like to exercise. But Haley knew that if he could change that, if he could start eating healthier food, if he could start exercising, if he could lose weight, he could reverse his diabetes. And she wanted to be part of her family's solution in supporting her dad to make healthier choices. So she went to her parents and she said, I want to start being the family chef. And her parents said to her, as her mother tells the story, you're 7, like you can't do this. And she said, no, I really think I can do this. And they said, okay, well, if you can stay within our family budget and you're really serious, you can start being our family chef. And so she started cooking, first dinner, and then she started also making breakfast and sending packed lunches with her dad to work. And her dad, thankfully, really liked the food that she made, which was a lot healthier than what he had been eating. He also, on his own, started exercising. He lost a lot of weight, and he controlled his diabetes. And Haley thought that was pretty amazing, that she'd been part of literally saving her dad's life. So she started talking to her friends about what she'd done. She'd helped some of them become chefs. She then decided to launch an online cookbook to help other kids her age, and even some of us who are older, make healthier choices in the kitchen. And then Hyatt Hotels hired her to rewrite all of their kids and family menus at their hotels across the country. So I think that's pretty amazing and instructive. It's amazing because it's clearly an amazing trajectory of impact in so many concentric circles. But I think it's also really instructive because we often don't know where we're going to wind up. We just have to start and have the courage to begin. And Haley, I think, really is a testament to that. She's now 14, so she's been a change maker and an activist for literally half her life. This is Alex. When Alex was even younger than Haley, when he was 6, he realized 2 things pretty simultaneously. He realized that whenever he finished building a Lego set, he always had leftover Lego bricks. And he thought, well, if I always have leftover Lego bricks, probably other kids like me who love Legos have leftover Lego bricks too. And around the same time, he realized that in Southern California, where he lived with his parents, not everyone was lucky enough to have a home. And he decided when he grew up that he wanted to solve homelessness. But at the time, he thought, well, I'm 6. I can't solve homelessness right now. You're laughing, but this is really how he tells his story. But surely there's something that I can do to still make a difference. So he decided to start collecting Lego bricks and fashioning full Lego sets out of those Lego bricks and giving them to homeless shelters because he believes that every kid has a right to play. And he decided even if he couldn't solve a lot of the big structural issues around homelessness, he could still help every child have a right to play. So fast forward now almost 8 years, and Alex has donated literally thousands and thousands and thousands of Lego sets across Southern California and now into Northern California through his Brickshare drive. And I think that's important because even if we can't solve the big problems at any moment in time, particularly probably when we're 6, doesn't mean that we still can't make a meaningful impact. Now this is Celia, obviously with an elephant. When Celia was 14, living in Hong Kong, she became aware of this, that 2/3 of Africa's elephant population have been lost, largely because of illegal poaching, in my lifetime, since 1980. And she knew that what was fueling the slaughter of elephants like this was a demand for ivory, largely coming out of Hong Kong and China. And she learned that most people in Hong Kong and China didn't know that ivory only came from dead elephants. So she thought, surely, if people know that ivory only comes from dead elephants, they'll stop buying ivory. And she understood that this was important, not only as a conservation issue, but also as an economic empowerment issue, because so many countries are dependent on the tourism that big game like elephants bring to their economies. It disproportionately impacts women because women are more likely to be employed in those industries. And so Celia understood that fighting for elephant conservation wasn't only an ecological imperative, but was about so much more. She thought, surely, if people understand that ivory only comes from dead elephants, and that this is connected to other issues that people probably already care about, we can get people to stop buying ivory. So she launched a sort of one-woman campaign. She had petitions on change.org, she had social media programs, she wrote to all of the local government officials in Hong Kong, she reached out to her family in China, mainland China, so they would do the same, and nobody paid any attention to her. So she thought, well, I need a partner. I need someone who will really raise visibility about this and what the solution is. And so she reached out to Yao Ming, the former NBA superstar who had just retired and was living in China at the time. And Yao Ming agreed to meet with her. Now, Yao Ming might have agreed to meet with her if she was my age, when I wrote this book, 34, but he probably agreed to meet with her because she was 14 and he was really struck and inspired by her passion. So they met, and today, a few years after that first meeting, Yao Ming is, bar none, the most identifiable face of the anti-ivory efforts in China. And China has made tremendous strides, as have Hong Kong, in getting rid of their ivory stockpiles and cracking down on illegal ivory being trafficked into the country. And all that might have happened without Yao Ming, but it might not have. And Yao Ming might have gotten involved without Celia, but thankfully, we'll never know. And so I tell these stories because it's really one of the main reasons that I wrote It's Your World, to use the platform that I've been given to share and amplify stories of young people who are changing the worlds around them, in their homes and across the globe. And admittedly, I've long believed that every one of us can make a difference for many of the reasons that Bo articulated. An ethos that certainly was reinforced by Sidwell, and one I'm really grateful to have inherited from my grandmother and my parents. And one more embarrassing example of how long I've believed that. I wrote this letter to President Reagan when I was 5. It says, "Dear Mr. President, I have seen The Sound of Music. The Nazis don't look like very nice people. Please don't go to their cemetery. Sincerely, Chelsea Clinton." And yes, that is a rainbow and heart sticker at the bottom of the letter, and I included a whole sheet of rainbow and heart stickers as a gesture of goodwill with the letter to the president. I had learned from reading the newspaper that President Reagan was going on a state visit to what was then West Germany. And he was planning on going to Bitburg Cemetery, which at the time was the national cemetery of West Germany and where the majority of the Third Reich leadership was buried. And I didn't think an American president should be going to pay his respects on behalf of our country to a place where Nazis were buried. So I wrote this letter. I went to the mailbox literally every day for at least a month, probably 2. I never got a response. I was pretty crushed by that, but I was far more disappointed that President Reagan still went to the cemetery. His justification was that he only stayed 8.5 minutes. I sort of think you either do something or you don't. Thankfully, my parents made me feel as valued and validated for having written a letter and not having gotten a response or had an impact as they would have if I had gotten a response or been part of having an impact. And we have a motto in my family that it's always better to get caught trying. And certainly that is another lesson that was deeply reinforced while I was at Sidwell. And I was talking to Bo and a couple of students earlier about some of the lessons that I still carry with me from Sidwell. And one of the first that I shared was the sense of competing only against my own potential, kind of to the limits of my heart and mind, and not against my fellow students, and certainly not against my friends, a couple of whom are here this evening. And that was a tremendous gift that Sidwell gave me, because I am a deeply competitive person, whether it's about sort of changing the world or how I was going to do on my chemistry test in 10th or 11th grade, whatever grade we took chemistry. And I don't know if I would have the same sense of grounding and the same sense of kind of stress to stretch to the limits of my heart and mind as judged against those limits and not against others if I hadn't had the benefit of a Sidwell and a Friends education and the mentorship and guidance and leadership of people like Bo. I also don't think I understood when I was 13 how important that would be in my life, given the environment in which I live and work and even fight on an almost daily basis. So I'm incredibly grateful to Bo for so much, and to Sidwell and to a Friends education for so much. I don't know if I would have written this book without it, or made so many of the other affirmative and I hope peace-creating decisions that I've made in my life. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer, or at least try to answer, any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chelsea. It was pretty clear only a Friends School graduate could have made that speech. And we should also mention that Mark, Chelsea's husband, is a graduate of Friends Central in Philadelphia. So Quakers all around. We're going to start the questions with two students who are clerks of our service committee. They'll ask the first two questions, and then we'll move to the audience.
Thank you, Bill. Hi. I'm Matthew Brunstad. I'm a senior representative for the service committee at Friends, as Bo said. And later this month, I'm bringing in a speaker and also hosting some follow-up activities on the subject of mass incarceration. And it's a topic of concern for me and for a number of other students at my school, just because a lot of the statistics are rather shocking. A lot of youth are put away in prison, and this potentially ruins their lives, and it's something that I think we all should address, and it's an issue I'm passionate about. But I was wondering if you had to single out a specific issue that you think youth, especially at our school, should be responsible for and kind of take action to. What issue would that be?
Matthew, I think the answer to that question has as many answers as there are students. I mean, I would never be so arrogant to say you should care about this. I will say I think it is important and gratifying to me as someone who also cares about the challenge that mass incarceration presents for our country, and does a lot of work on the juvenile justice system, kind of through my work with the Clinton Foundation, that I think this is an area where you can play a role in a couple of ways. I think sometimes we take for granted that people know things that we know. And I found that often is not the case. So while you know, and your friends here may know, statistics like 1 out of 3 every African American men can expect to spend at least some time under the supervision of the justice system, and 1 out of every 31 Americans is under the supervision of the justice system, right? The second statistic is shocking enough. The first statistic is shocking and a moral outrage. You can't take for granted that other people know that. And similarly, I don't think you can take for granted that other people know how we both prevent the continuation of this challenge in our country, reforming sentencing laws, reforming minimum sentencing guidelines, reforming 3 strikes laws, reforming kind of the criteria for how justices of the Supreme Court are even thought about and appointed, much less judges at every other level. So I hope that you'll talk to people who may not know what you know, because until this is not just a kind of liberal issue, candidly, we won't have a sufficient consensus to really move the needle. And this is an area that has to have a legislative and a judicial remedy. Right? There's some things that we can do as citizen activists alone, but this is an area where we do need kind of government and the court system to shift. So that's my first answer. My second answer is preempting a question that I may or may not get asked, but historically I'm asked in every setting these days. I'm asked when I'm talking about It's Your World. I'm asked when I'm talking about the Clinton Foundation. I'm asked when I'm talking about my mom's campaign. I'm asked when I'm being interviewed by someone from the media. I'm asked when I'm kind of having a one-on-one conversation, when someone stops me in Duane Reade. And people ask me, do you have plans to run for political office? And I understand why they ask me that question. My dad was president, my mom's running for president, my last name's Clinton. I mean, pick a reason why someone might be asking me that question. And it's a question I've literally been asked my whole life. One of my earliest memories is being 3 years old. My dad was running for re-election as governor, and I was at a rally and I was standing off to the side waving an American flag. Because when you're 3, there's not a lot else you can do to be an enthusiastic participant than wave an American flag. And a woman came up to me and she said, Chelsea, do you think you'll run for governor of Arkansas one day? And I think my response was something like, ma'am, I'm 3. But I share that because it's a question I've been asked my whole life. And it's a question I ask myself, and I answer in a certain set of follow-up questions, which I'm happy to share if someone asks a follow-up question. But it's not just a question that I should be asking myself and that people should be asking me. Right, Matthew, if you care about things that can only be changed, at least in part or in whole, with the political system, I hope you think about one day running for office. Because too often, I think people are dissuaded by either the scrutiny, which is certainly intense, or the volume, which is certainly loud, or the hate speech rhetoric that is all too common. And so people don't step forward to engage in the political process. But so much of what I'm sure you care about, and mass incarceration is a perfect example of that, can only be changed if we change the people who are in office at different levels who don't think it's an issue, and if we support people who are in office at different levels who know it's an issue and who are working to solve it. So the second part you solve by voting. The first part you solve by thinking about running for office or encouraging others who you believe could make a positive impact in running for office. When my dad left Georgetown 50 years ago, he thinks about half of his friends thought about a career in public service. When I left Stanford, I knew one person who at the time was thinking about running for public office. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but I think it's really important. So I hope you raise awareness about the challenges and the solutions that you think are important for people to be cognizant of here in New York City and New York State and in our country today. And I hope in the future you and everyone here, but particularly young people, think about running for public office one day to helping be part of affecting those solutions. So thank you for your question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Natalie and I'm clerk of the service committee. So we were just wondering if you could share a memory from volunteerism that you did while you were at Sidwell.
So since that was such a serious answer, I'll give you a funny story. So I was the head of the service committee at Sidwell. I think I was the head or the co-head for a couple of years, but I was on the service committee and part of the service team all 4 years of high school. I don't really remember when this is, but it was definitely when I was not a freshman, because I was at least an officer of the service committee. That's important because I felt responsibility for solving what I'm about to share. So we participated, we did a lot of work with Martha's Table, which is one of, if not the oldest soup kitchen and food pantry in Washington, D.C. One that still exists today, one that I continue to support. I was there a couple of months ago when I was back in Washington. One that I went and volunteered with my grandmother when she lived in Washington. And I don't know if I would have kind of encountered Martha's Table as early as I did without Sidwell. Another reason for me to be grateful to Sidwell. So the service committee participated in the Christmas party, the holiday party that Martha's Table hosted every year at the old post office. There was a guy who was quite large. This is an important part of the story, quite large. Definitely over 6 feet tall, definitely muscular. He was on the football team, who joined a lot of our service projects. He had signed up to come that day. I didn't know, someone else had said to Martha's Table, because they had asked kind of how many people are you bringing, and do you have any kind of big people who are on your team? And someone had answered and said, I don't know, we're bringing 20 people, and yes, we actually have this guy who's like 6 feet tall and really muscular, he'll be there. They said, great, he can dress up as Garfield. We've decided that we are gonna have like different people dress up as characters, even though Garfield's like not a Christmas character, dress up as characters that the kids know and are familiar with, right? So we get to the Christmas party, and this guy doesn't come. Can't remember, like, I don't know, football practice ran late or something happened, he's not there. But we were on the hook for providing a Garfield. So I dressed up as Garfield, which was totally fine when I was with the kids. But then I have this vivid memory of this very sweet old lady coming over and saying she'd always loved Garfield, and she sat on my lap. And while she was older, she was not small. I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? I don't want to speak, because if I speak, she's going to know that because she thought I clearly was this like handsome high school guy, and I was this really awkward high school girl. And so I just remember being so silent and just hoping, like, oh my gosh, this is so terrible, because I don't want to have a, ungracious, ungenerous thought right now, but I really hope that she gets up soon. But I was Garfield for 2 hours, and that was not what I expected to do when I went to the old post office. I thought I was going to be, I don't know, handing out cookies, but you just, I guess, never know what you're going to fall into once you've taken responsibility. So I haven't thought about that in a long time. Thank you for letting me think about my couple hours as Garfield.
Great answer. Any other questions? Yes, in the back row. I can't see who that is, but striped shirt. Is it Xander? Yes.
Do you ever think about one day running for office too, like your mom and
So, perfect example. I do, Xander, think about it, partly because I'm asked often, and I do hope, Xander, that you think about this question. So I'll tell you how I think about answering this question. So I think you have to decide a few things that have to come together to determine if you're going to run for public office. I think, one, you have to be dissatisfied with your current elected leadership and dissatisfied with whomever might be running to replace your elected leadership at the job that you're thinking about doing. That's really important. And I'll give you 2 stories as to why that's so important, Xander. A few years ago, you may remember, we stopped recycling in New York City briefly while Mayor Bloomberg was reevaluating the economics of the recycling program. And I was on the subway one day, and this woman came up to me, and she was so angry at President Obama because we had stopped recycling in New York City. And I said, well, I'm frustrated too, but I'm frustrated at Mayor Bloomberg. And I'm sure President and Mrs. Obama recycle diligently at the White House, but they have no impact on whether or not we recycle here in New York City. Second story is, I was very involved in the marriage equality fight here in New York. And a man came up to me shortly after we finally won marriage equality, after we had not succeeded in the first couple of efforts. And he came up and he said, I was phone banking with you, this is great, now I really hope President Obama can make this happen. And I said, well, we have something called the Constitution. And in the Constitution, certain things get rendered unto the states, and marriage is one of those. So we have to keep fighting this battle state by state, or we have to have the Supreme Court rule it an equal protection issue. Now, Xander, you don't need to worry about all the details of that at this moment. But what you do need to understand is there's some things that a mayor can do, and there are a lot of things a mayor can't do. There's some things a governor can do. There's a lot of things a governor alone can't do. There are a lot of things that a president can do, but there are also a lot of things that a president can't do because a mayor or a governor may be doing them. And so if you're thinking about running for public office,
you have to think, well, am I dissatisfied with who's representing me now? Either because they don't think mass incarceration is a big issue, or they don't have good ideas about how to solve the challenge for today, for people that were victims of this in the past, to prevent this from kind of being more of an issue in the future. And if the answer to that is, yes, I'm dissatisfied, you then have to think about whether or not you have a vision for what you would do in that job, so not another job, but that job, and how you would achieve change. I think you have to actually think about how you're going to do something, not just what you want to do. And then if you have the skills and the experience to be able to achieve the change in the way that you want to do it. And if all of those are yes, then you should run for public office. For me right now, I really like my city councilwoman. I don't know how many of you live in, I'm actually not even going to ask how many of you even know who your council person is. But for me, my council member is Ms. Mendez. I think she does a great job. I love my public advocate. I won't ask you how many of you even know that we have a public advocate in New York City, but she's pretty awesome. Her name is Letitia James. I like our mayor. I really like our governor. I like my representative, Carolyn Maloney. I like our senators. I'm sort of obsessed with Kristen Gillibrand. And I'm clearly a big fan of President Obama. I've talked about him at least 3 times already. So for me, I don't get to the second or third question. But I think it's a healthy exercise for all of us who care about making change to be asking ourselves that question. So Xander, you're clearly not old enough to vote yet. So then therefore you're not old enough to run for office in most places. Although there are a few places where you can actually run for office before you're old enough to vote. New York's not one of them. But I hope that you'll ask yourself that question throughout your life. And I hope the way that I think about it might be helpful to you when you're old enough to ask that question. So thank you for asking.
How has motherhood changed you, and what reminds you of yourself and your daughter?
Cyrus, these are such nice questions. Well, I would say the way that motherhood has changed me is that I feel an even greater intensity and level of responsibility about being part of a positive change in the world than I did before I became a mom. And I didn't know I could care anymore about some of what we've already talked about this evening, whether that's making healthy choices or solving the mass incarceration challenge in our country, or helping encourage young people to think about also being part of changing the political system, as well as just broad-based change until I became a mom. And I found that everything I cared about already, I somehow cared about even more intensely. And I just feel an even greater urgency about. And I didn't expect that. I think that's not an uncommon evolution for those of us who choose to and are lucky enough to become parents, that everything just feels sharper because my 16-month-old daughter Charlotte is in the world, and her future little brother or little sister, I hope, knock on wood, will arrive healthy and happy this summer. Your second question, what do I see of myself in my daughter? I worry this is just going to sound so inevitably self-aggrandizing because I don't think I can talk about my daughter in anything less than the most glowing terms. So my daughter's incredibly curious about the world around her. I'm also really curious about the world around me. She's very either determined or stubborn, depending on how you look at it. And when she's trying to figure out something right now, Cyrus, she's trying to figure out, how to put puzzle pieces together or Legos together. Right, not kind of solving big problems, but those building blocks are part of what I hope will help her solve big problems later in life. And I love to solve problems, and I am also a pretty determined or stubborn person, depending on how you look at it. So I don't know if that's just kind of what I want to see about myself, because I see that in her, but I think I know myself well enough to say that either we share that or she inherited that in part from me. I will say something that has been such a gift is just the completely unadulterated, unabashed joy that she gives me every day. I didn't know I could have such a purity of emotion, kind of completely trapped in just happiness and gratitude in the moments I get to share with her. And I find that deeply, deeply humbling. So thank you for giving me the chance to talk about her. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
What did you want to be when you were growing up?
Well, I wanted to be lots of different things depending on the year, admittedly. When I was really little, I wanted to be an astronaut or an engineer. I was obsessed with space. I loved building things. I think I probably read somewhere that kids who really liked playing with Legos and other kind of assembly toys were more likely to be engineers. I don't even think I knew what that meant when I was 3 or 4, but if you asked me when I was 3 or 4, I said I wanted to kind of be an astronaut because I love space, or that I wanted to be an engineer because someone had probably told me or I had read that that's kind of what you did if you wanted to build things. But pretty quickly I realized I was really interested in everything related to health. And so when I realized that, I first thought, well, I want to be a doctor because that's the only thing kind of that I knew of in health. But as I got older, I realized I was more interested in the systems that influence people's health. It's one of the reasons why I do work in the juvenile justice system. I think it's important that we go to where people are if we want to help change the environments around them to enable health to be easier and more rooted in dignity for people. So I realized pretty early on, I don't know, I was maybe 10 or 11, that I wanted to do something in health and in public health. But up until then, there was a lot that came before that. But when I was really little, the first thing I remember wanting to be was an astronaut or an engineer. Yeah. Yes. Well, I think there are so many more ways for you to have your voice heard now than there were when I was your age. I think it's hard to overestimate the impact that mass engagement online really does have in either helping to create a debate, inform a debate, shape a debate, sometimes misinform a debate or misshape a debate too. So kind of joining petitions, following organizations that you believe in, people that are old enough to vote pay attention to all of that. I also think it's important to realize that even in New York, you have a huge selection bias in your life in the way that I do, right? I'm surrounded by people who do vote, who do believe that being a citizen and being engaged in citizen service is not an option for those of us that are healthy enough to do so. That's not true for a lot of people. In New York City, if we have 1/3 of people vote in our midterm elections or our primaries, that's pretty good. Right? So you can do a lot to encourage people who may not be registered or may not think an election is important, who are old enough to vote, to register, to get engaged, to show up and vote, or to vote by absentee. Because I think surely we should at least be able to have half of the people in our city vote. And there's a lot of places where you can go where people are historically not registered, like homeless shelters, right? You don't have to be 18 to help register someone to vote. So I think there's a lot that you can do with your time, your energy, kind of your name, your imprimatur, to help inform and enfranchise other people in the political process, as well as, of course, talking to your family and your friends who are at least 18. To register and to vote. Yeah, so thank you. Yes.
How long have you worked at the public office, and when did you start thinking about working there?
Well, I've never held public office, so I've never worked in a public office except for when I was probably about your age, and I would go to my dad's office in the State House when he was governor, and I had a little desk there, and I would do my homework, or I would color. I loved coloring books, or build Lego sets. So never for me, but clearly it is something I think about, even though it's not the right option for me now. And it's something I've been thinking about, as I shared earlier, my whole life. But I've never held political office. I've never run for political office. But I do think who runs for and holds political office is hugely important. Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Yes.
What did you feel when your parents got elected to important position?
Well, when I was born, my dad was governor of Arkansas. So I don't remember how I felt then because it had happened before I was born. But I do remember being really grateful that my parents always talked to me about why they were making the choices they were making. So whether that was kind of my mom being a really active and engaged First Lady of Arkansas in the 1980s when that was really unpopular, and there were people who said, without kind of any air of apology or self-awareness that kind of a First Lady's job was just to be a First Lady and take care of her husband in the governor's mansion, right? How dare she be a lawyer? How dare she be activist? How dare she kind of work with the Legal Services Corporation in Arkansas? And so I had to think about kind of how I felt pretty early on because there was so much criticism pretty early on. And a lot of it was directed at my mom. Some of it was also very much directed at my dad. In 1986, my dad was running for re-election. And he was running against a man named Frank White. And Frank White represented the worst of Arkansas's past. He was an active segregationist. He was an active sexist. He would say absolutely he thought there were jobs that African Americans and women just should not have. And he wanted to wrench Arkansas back to the Dark Ages, and he thought my parents represented everything that was wrong about the 20th century, or modernity, or egalitarianism, or anything else probably in that list. And he said really vicious things about my dad and my mom, and he said how much he pitied me. So I really think when someone starts attacking a 6-year-old, it's pretty illuminating of the quality of their character. But my family, I'm really grateful that my parents protected me from the worst of it, but also didn't protect me so much so that I wasn't aware that it was happening. Because I went to a big public school and kids talked to me about what they'd heard on the news. They talked to me about what they'd heard on the radio. They talked to me about maybe what their parents were repeating they'd heard from Frank White. And so my parents and I would have mock debates where one of us would play my dad and one of us would play Frank White and one of us would play the moderator. And we would have 2 different types of debates. We would have debates that were just about the issues, like, Governor Clinton, why do you believe in universal pre-kindergarten? This was back before it was fashionable to believe in universal pre-kindergarten. It was something my parents were working on in Arkansas, and I had to know what that meant because I had to have a position about this while I was 6. But that was important because then we would have debates like what Frank White wanted to have, and they would say terrible things about my dad, and the moderator would ask these ridiculously offensive questions, and I had to figure out how to protect and defend myself from that without ever going to that level. Ensuring that I was both kind of saying what I believed, but also behaving in the way that I believed was right. And I'm really grateful to that because my parents ensured that I had a safe space to talk about my feelings, that they ensured I did feel things and that I felt those things first, kind of in the sanctity of our home and not kind of in the scary place that elementary hallways can be. But that I also learned how to defend myself against that, because that taught me a really valuable lesson. When people attack you for things that are about your gender or your race or your hair, which happened to me, or the fact that I wore glasses, which happened to me, or my appearance, which happened to me, or your sexual orientation or your gender identity, that's about them and not about you. And that has been a hugely important lesson for me, and I'm really grateful that my parents ensured I learned that pretty early on, and that I learned that there absolutely should be a battle of ideas, and there absolutely should not be a battle on other fronts in politics. So perversely, I have to be grateful to the poor example of Frank White, and really grateful to the good example of my parents. And I think about that a lot with my daughter, because certainly the world has gotten only more kind of vicious in many ways than it was 30 years ago. So thank you for asking me a question about feelings, because it's something I think about a lot now as a mom that I haven't had to think about in many, many years.
Okay, I think we probably need to bring things to a close because Chelsea and Mark need to get home for a certain debate that is coming on a little bit later. But we want to thank you both for giving us your time. Thank you very much.